Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order, and I say good morning to all of you, and welcome to today's hearing entitled STEM in Action, Inspiring the Science and Engineering Workforce of Tomorrow. Don't be dismayed by the empty seats here, because everybody has several committees, and we're in a kind of a crucial time in Congress right now when our ratings aren't the highest in the history of Congress, and they're all working hard and trying to set in on several committees at one time. But we have a court report over here. It takes down everything you say and do, and goes into the congressional record, and people will read what you're saying and doing 100 years from now. And that's what's important. And every other member of Congress gets a copy of your testimony, and usually either they read it or somebody on their committee reads it to them. And but they'll be coming and going from time to time. Mr. Rohrabacher's here, and he's going to introduce, because of personal friendship, one of the those of you that will be testifying. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, the biographies, and the truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement, and everybody will have other opening statements will be put in the record. So I say to you, good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone here today for the second in a series of STEM in Action hearings. The purpose of this hearing will be to showcase a variety of public-private partnerships and initiatives across the nation that are successfully inspiring the future science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM workforce. The federal government is investing several billion a year on STEM education. While there may be federal role, industry, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, and local governments have also acknowledged the importance of making investments in STEM. Partnerships and initiatives formed by these investments are very critical to the program. Particularly in this difficult budget climate, we want to highlight some of these efforts and partnerships that are thriving with little or no federal investment. Specifically, the witnesses before us are all involved with tremendously successful STEM-related competitions. As we can all agree, a well-educated and trained STEM workforce is imperative and key to our future economic prosperity, but we have to capture and hold the attention of our nation's youth in science and engineering so they'll want to pursue these careers, not simply be forced into them simply because we need them. Sitting in a classroom and just memorizing text or taking notes can often drain the enthusiasm from even the most promising student or our students. That's why it's important for us to hear from these folks about their creative alternatives to teach and inspire kids who may not even realize they're learning. Today we have witnesses from the corporate, foundation, and nonprofit worlds showcasing their creative efforts to inspire, motivate, and produce our next generation of scientists and engineers with little or no federal funds. Our nation's always been number one in science and innovation. In order to maintain this prominence, we have to have an, quote, all hands on deck, unquote, attitude toward it. Everyone in some way, shape, or form has to have a role to play in STEM education so that our children and our grandchildren can also experience a vibrant economy with access to good, solid jobs. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses, and I thank you for being here with us today. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Johnson for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses that have been invited today. As I've said so many times before, we truly have a STEM education crisis in this country. And I don't need to remind this audience about how poorly too many of our students perform on tests of math and science proficiency, or how important it is for the future of our country that we do something to address this serious problem. By we, I mean all of the stakeholders: federal agencies, states, school districts, businesses, nonprofit organizations, and parents. We must all work together to leverage our respective strengths and resources to tackle this issue. STEM education in this country is truly a complex and grand challenge that no one entity can solve alone. Today's witnesses represent the private sector. Companies ranging in size from multinational enterprises on down to local businesses are realizing more and more how critical it is to the long-term success of their businesses that they have access to a highly skilled and well-prepared workforce. While our government is turning the clock back, other countries are pouring resources into building not just their associate and bachelor degree level workforce, but also their PhD level research scientists, engineers, providing them a competitive edge we once took for granted. One thing that's interesting to me is that while some of my colleagues in Congress think the federal government has no role here, an increasing number of major U.S. companies are turning to partnerships with government, including the federal government, to achieve their workforce needs. President Obama also recognized the importance of partnerships when he launched the Educate to Innovate campaign last year. As part of this campaign, the private sector coordinated with the White House to launch Change the Equation. Change the Equation brought together a coalition of more than 100 CEOs from some of the nation's largest companies, all dedicated to working together to improve STEM education in the country. These companies, of course, include Time Warner Cable, ExxonMobil, and Xerox, to name a few, have all committed resources to STEM programs across the country. Many of these successful programs are run in partnership with federal agencies such as NASA and the National Science Foundation. Among the new public-private partnerships announced as part of the President's Educate to Innovate campaign was the National STEM Video Game Challenge. And I look forward to hearing from Mr. Gallagher about the National STEM Video Game Challenge and how he and his colleagues work with the White House and other partners to make the competition a success. Competitions and challenges have tremendous potential to both inspire students and teach the STEM knowledge and skills in ways that the traditional classroom teaching cannot. However, we also know from a recent National Academy's report on informal STEM learning and a hearing we held at them this same topic in the 111th Congress that there remains a big gap in understanding how students learn outside the classroom and to what extent informal experiences influences their long-term interest and success in STEM. Most of what we know or think we know is based on anecdotes or attitudinal surveys. Here there is a clear and unique federal role in developing the necessary body of knowledge. The National Science Foundation is the leading entity in this country for funding research on STEM learning in both formal and informal environments, including competitions. The results of NSF-funded research over many decades have helped and will continue to help to ensure that education practitioners are incorporating effective practices with measurable results. At the end of the day, what counts is whether the STEM programs we are hearing about are achieving their desired results, not how much money we are spending on them or even how many students they touch. We're all in this together. I commend the witnesses and your colleagues in private sector for your efforts in helping to improve STEM education in this country. But I'd also like to repeat a request that I made at our last STEM hearing, that we not continue to ignore the unique and important role of the federal government in improving STEM education in this country. Mr. Hall, I thank you very much for this hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the ladies. Thank the gentlelady from Texas. She yields back. And if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, statements can be added to the record at this point or a little bit later. And at this time, I want to begin to introduce our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Tony Norman, President and CEO of Innovation First International, which Mr. Norman founded in 1999. I'm proud to say he's a constituent from my district. One of the interesting things about Tony and Innovation First is the commitment they make to the local community of Greenville, Texas. If you visit their plants, you'll see local high school students working on projects and interning in the facility to learn more about engineering and technology. Many of these students have gone on to college to study engineering at Tony's suggestion and his behest, and he truly gives back to his hometown, wants to build a lasting success for Greenville and for the nation, and he's an international operator. I find him sometimes in China, sometimes he's somewhere in Europe, but he's kind of hard to find, but we're very fortunate to have him here today because he's one of the busiest men I know. I had the pleasure of speaking at one of his operations in Orlando. I think there were 5,000 or 10,000 folks there. And Tony told me I had 3 minutes to speak, and I got into my speech about a minute and a half, and he was doing what my wife always does to me when I'm making speeches. He was doing like this. And I think he meant for me to stop. And I later learned that with all the great technology in the bosom of the United States of America right there in the crowd, we had a malfunction of some type. I don't know what it was, but it was a great meeting with a lot of young kids that were there. Those who won were happy. Those who lost were determined to come back and win next year. But it really gives you a new perspective on the country when you see these youngsters, that folks like these three people that are here testifying for us today have bragged on, supported, and helped, and look forward to. Our second witness is Mrs. Nancy Conrad, and I've known her husband for many years. And at this time, I yield to Mr. Rohrabacher of California to introduce Mrs. Conrad. I really wanted to introduce her, but Rohrabacher outranks me, and he's a guy that I really need his vote every now and then. I'm even going out to his home Sunday to make a speech for him Sunday at noon, and going to fly back Sunday night. That's how much I think of Mr. Rohrabacher. So you ought to be helping me a little more than you are. Recognize Mr. Rohrabacher to introduce Ms. Conrad.
You got it, Mr. Chairman. You got it. It's my personal and professional pleasure to introduce Nancy Conrad to members of the committee and to all of you. She has been a close friend for many years. I was a close friend, of course, when Pete was alive, and I was a young member of this committee, and he was a very inspiring human being, and we know all of his exploits in terms of Apollo 12 and the third man on the moon. But when Pete was taken from us, Nancy picked up the challenge of making sure that America and the world keeps moving outward, and realized that perhaps the most important thing we have to do to achieve the goal of keeping America the #1 space power and keeping humankind in the ascension into space was the fact that we have to have our young people trained and motivated to be able to participate in this great task that humankind has, which is to deliver our species beyond where we're at and into the heavens and into the universe. So with this, after Pete's passing, Nancy started the Spirit of Innovation Awards as part of the Pete Conrad Foundation. She herself, of course, was an English teacher and very involved in education, and has been well known throughout the world as an advocate for science education and science as part of a young person's curriculum. But today she's going to be, I believe, talking to us about the Spirit of Innovation Award, and I believe she deserves an award for innovation in her approach. And I think that I'm looking forward to hearing all about it, and I know that it should inspire members of this committee, but also we should be grateful, and the students who are participating in this should be grateful for something that excites young people about science, engineering, mathematics, things that will carry humankind to our next step. So we welcome Nancy Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Nancy, we do admire and respect you, and remember the service of you and your husband. And reclaiming my time, thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher, for the good introduction. Our third witness and final witness is Mr. Michael D. Gallagher, President and CEO of the Entertainment Software Association. Mr. Gallagher also leads the ESA's partnership with the Congressional Caucus for Competitiveness in Entertainment Technology. Previously, he was the Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information at the U.S. Department of Commerce. and I had the pleasure of visiting with him some time ago. And we thank all of you because we know it's trouble, expensive. You have to have time to get ready for this testimony. You had to come here from somewhere, and you have to eat while you're here and stay somewhere while you're here. You give a lot to be here, and we appreciate you. And we really ought to have these seats full, but as I explained to you, we're in kind of a desperate time up here. We're trying to survive a lot of bad situations that's happening to our country, and we thank you for giving this time what I'm trying to say and not saying it too well. But as our witnesses should know, and probably do know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes. We're not going to hit the gavel on you if you go over 5 minutes, but it's close to 5 minutes as you can stay. The more likely you are to win the drawing that we may have when this is over. But the members of the Commercial Committee will have 5 minutes to ask questions. We'll try to hold them to that same. So I recognize our first witness, Mr. Norman, now for 5 minutes, but you won't be held to that.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, committee members, for inviting me here. I have 20 years of experience in educational robotics, and it basically started back when I worked as an electrical engineer at one of the largest defense contractors for this country. We spent a lot of time inspiring kids and youth to take careers in STEM education. And in fact, one of the accomplishments we actually had was get to bring those kids here to the White House after winning a championship. Because of that experience that we kept seeing how these kids kept growing in their inspiration, myself and one of the other team members decided, you know what, let's believe our own medicine here and let's start our own company. So we started our own company, as Congressman Hall said, in Greenville, Texas. And it's really a great high-growth story. In the last 3 years, we've created 150 jobs. We now have offices worldwide. And just to kind of give you a quick review of a few of them, one of our divisions, Rack Solutions, builds racking equipment for data centers and actually a few products for the U.S. military. And the exciting part is, in this very highly competitive market we're in, we are actually able to compete with U.S. manufacturing. So we felt that was a great accomplishment. We actually do know kids. In fact, we know kids so well that one of our most successful companies is creating toys. This toy division was actually inspiration as well from the robotics program we've been participating with, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And our largest accomplishment to date was last year. We were just received the Specialty Toy of the Year in the toy industry. So that's was pretty exciting for us. The VEX Robotics Design System is basically from our third division. It was created as an educational robotics kit, and it's really designed for an open-ended problem solving. It's not just a set of instructions you actually go through. But really, it's more than just a kit. It's the only platform with significant penetration in the daytime classroom and extracurricular competitions. So that's extremely important, and I hope to emphasize that a little bit later. We are showing up everywhere in the classroom, and I was just curious if you guys could find the VEX robot in this picture. Project Lead the Way is one of our partners. We're partnered with many 501c3s. Project Lead the Way is the largest daytime curricular program in the U.S., and they endorse the platform and also endorse our robotics competition as well as their competition. Technology Student Association, another partner of ours in the space, they are actually a co-curricular program where they are in the classroom and have competitions out of the classroom. They run about 200 competitions, but for robotics, they actually came to us and joined the VEX Robotics competition. Another 501c3 BEST, Boosting Engineering, Science, and Technology, is another inspiring. This one is free to all the schools that participate, and all of their electronics and sensors are basically from the VEX robotics system because we have the leading platform in the educational space. So we come to the actual VEX robotics competition itself. Before basically seeing the partners we have with the equipment we provided, this last year where Congressman Hall was there, we were at Disney World. These are some of our corporate sponsors that we're pretty proud of. VEX is the largest middle school and high school robotics competition in the world. This is kind of a comparison of where we compare to some of our other programs that are out there as well. Excuse me. This is basically, I want to kind of take you through and show you a few images from the competition. It's really hard to describe the excitement and the feeling you get there and the enthusiasms that the kids actually feel. and the scale of it. Basically, it takes a lot of donations from corporate sponsors to actually make an event of this size actually happen. But it affects the students in such a way that we're getting to kids that never would be interested in science and technology, and it's basically helping build that workforce for the future. You can see the scale of this event. Once again, this was our main arena for the finals, and the pit area in the previous slide shows you just the enormous. It's like a huge trade show. Over 600 teams were at this event. And of course, the excitement. Getting them ready, getting them exciting about science and technology, and putting these corporations on display. So as a corporation donates, it's not just a blind donation. They're putting their company on display. So when it comes to recruiting these kids and building that workforce for the future, they're actually there ready, and the students know who they are, and in fact, they want to actually go to that company. Recently, we've done quite a bit with the Boy Scouts of America. We helped them create their first robotics merit badge. We had a big showing at their jamboree, and it was extremely exciting. Same thing up here at the mall in D.C. And I'm just going to end here with, we really plan to continue to forge a relationship with more nonprofits, with industry, with leaders in the corporate world, and really help try to build and inspire that workforce for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now recognize Mr. Gallagher for 5 minutes for his testimony. I mean, Mrs. Conrad for her testimony. Same 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our participation in solving America's STEM education crisis, or as I call it, the edudemic. In a recent article in the New York Times, Tom Friedman said, "If we want more jobs, we need to create more Steve Jobs." Steve Jobs took his knowledge of STEM and created a phenomenon that impacts our lives in ways we can't even currently quantify. Bill Gates, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Mark Zuckerberg, they've done the same thing. They too have taken their knowledge of STEM, combined it with innovation and entrepreneurship, and created world-changing breakthroughs which have forever altered the way knowledge is valued, shared, and utilized. The hallmark of America's culture is innovation and entrepreneurship. It's how we got to the moon. It's how companies like Apple, Facebook, and Google were formed. It's how our country will continue to explore the universe, discover cures for disease, and become good stewards of the world we share with our global neighbors. If we're to reinforce America's economic stability and ignite our nation's passion for STEM education, we need to embrace an academic plan that focuses on the relevance of the knowledge we share with our students. We all know memorizing facts to pass a test isn't doing the job. The Spirit of Innovation Awards program, the flagship of the Conrad Foundation, is rooted in this concept. Our program challenges teams of high school students to create solutions to real-world problems using STEM-based principles and practices supported by innovative thinking and entrepreneurial skills. We are energizing the next generation of entrepreneurs and innovators needed to sustain our economy. Students who participate in the program come from all socioeconomic levels. Our student entries come from across the United States, from the Navajo Nation to Thomas Jefferson High School, ranked the #1 high school in the country. We're pleased that 1/3 of our students are girls and 1/3 are inner city students. The Spirit of Innovation Awards program operates year-round through our online community and our annual event. Our teams are supported in their journey by their teachers and our community of mentors and experts who together endeavor to help these students hone their own design skills as they create the innovative products. From aerospace and energy to cybersecurity and nutrition, no question is too large for these students. Finalist teams are selected to participate in our Innovation Summit at NASA Ames Research Center, where they meet world-renowned scientists and entrepreneurs from industry, government, academia, and venture capital. The students present their ideas and are coached and mentored by these experts with the intent of bringing the students' product to the marketplace. Winners are awarded a grant to continue the development of their product, and selected teams are invited into our portal, where we assist them in patenting their product if it's needed, and then licensing their intellectual property. This is a way for them to monetize their ideas without dropping out of school to create companies. We are 4 years young and already seeing amazing results. Let me provide you with a few examples. Winning teams of the past have addressed nutrition needs for astronauts, developed light electric cars, and a smartphone biomedical application for monitoring heart rates. Daniel and Isaac from Katy, Texas, have 2 patents on an offshore geothermal energy generating system, and they have been archived into the Kennedy Presidential Library. Michaela and Shannon from Battle Creek, Michigan, created a nutrition bar that meets NASA's standards for nutrition and stability in microgravity. They've been honored at the White House, and recently their product was flown aboard STS-134. This is where real science gets real. Our program and the media coverage our students receive shines a spotlight on how cool science can be and how interesting and challenging the careers in STEM can be. We are not just growing a program, we are driving a movement. We've turned geeks into rock stars. Our competition is open to all who wish to participate, free of charge. We are supported in partnership with Lockheed Martin, PepsiCo, and Kraft Foods. We receive program support from NASA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the American Society for Nutrition, the William James Foundation, the National Institute of Health, Sigma Xi, museums and science centers, Popular Science Magazine, Space Ref, and STEM Connector. This year, we are also taking advantage of a unique opportunity to provide our winning teams of students with a global scientific experience. In partnership with the Department of State, we are planning for winning teams to travel to a major international conference on sustainable development to be held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 2012. Interactions with scientists from around the world will have a lasting impression on these students whose paths may be toward global science and technology. We are solely funded through philanthropic grants and individual and corporate entities. Our biggest challenge is funding the program so we can scale it to reach mass numbers of students and expand the services and programs associated with the contest. The Spirit of Innovation Awards program is the only incentivized learning program to combine STEM with innovation and entrepreneurship. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, I believe we must all accept the challenge to embrace and propel our students to tomorrow's innovation generation. While our education system may be broken, our students are not. When given the opportunities, their talents shine. They're amazing, they're innovative, and they're brilliant. Our students will be the next Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin. This is how we engage America in STEM education, and this is how we build the innovative workforce for the future. We need to leave a better country for our children, but we also need to leave better children for our country. Thank you for your kind attention, and I will be delighted to answer your questions.
And we thank you. I do now recognize Mr. Gallagher for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hall, Ranking Member Johnson, distinguished members of the committee, I am grateful for the opportunity to testify at this hearing this morning. My name is Michael Gallagher, and I am the President and CEO of the Entertainment Software Association, the trade association that represents the industry that creates video games on virtually every device that has a screen and a battery, including video game consoles, personal computers, handheld devices like cell phones, and over the Internet. We at ESA, the staff and the members, are very appreciative of the continued focus of this committee on the limitless value of technology in education and the importance that that focus has to the American workforce in the years ahead as well as today, and we're grateful to be part of this conversation. Webster's dictionary defines invent. To invent is to produce for the first time through the use of the imagination or of ingenious thinking and experiment. Inventions are the bedrock of the United States economy since it was born. If you look at our history, in addition to the current technologies that Mrs. Conrad highlighted, but going back to the light bulb, planes, trains, and automobiles, the cell phone, telephones in general, a computer and the internet. Each of these breakthroughs, each of these inventions created and spawned scores of millions of jobs for generations of Americans. What they all share in common are root elements in STEM and in STEM education. It's of vital economic interest for our country that we continue to be as dynamic and world-leading as possible in the area of educating our youth in STEM. Yet today, there's a yawning gap between our needs as a society and as a country and what we're producing in the classroom, and that gap is recognized in a bicameral, bipartisan, state and federal arenas. Business and the public sector all agree that we're in a mode where we must enhance our productivity in the classroom for the benefit of our current and our future economic aspirations. The video game industry is living in this challenge. Today, we are a $25 billion domestic industry. We've grown 120% over the last 5 years. And the jobs that are created are across the country in 30 different states where we have sites and enormous productivity coming from jobs in our industry. These jobs are fundamentally dependent on physics, math, computer science, and the core STEM curricula that this hearing is focused upon. However, beyond our industry, we also have the need of broader corporate America looking at trying to innovate and invent in today's economy. And in a study that was concluded a year ago, over 100 of the Fortune 500 companies indicated that they would be using video game technology to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of their workforce. And these are companies like Bank of America, IBM, Canon, American Express, and others who are seeing the value of the technology that is inherent in what we do. Looking beyond, however, just the corporate opportunity, ESA was approached by the Joan Gans Cooney Center, otherwise known as Sesame Street, about 3 years ago, and was challenged to do more in the area of education because they, as educators, understood the connection between our industry and youth. And many studies show, Pew has a study that shows, not surprisingly, that 97% of boys play video games, but 94% of girls do as well. And so we have a medium that is creative, that is dynamic, that is captivating to the youth of our country. We should be capturing that energy. So in partnership with Microsoft, PlayStation, Electronic Arts within our industry, as well as the Joan Gans Cooney Center, the MacArthur Foundation, Eline Ventures, and AMD, we launched 2 different competitions focused on capturing that interest of youth and putting it into the classroom in a practical, exciting way for education purposes. I look forward in the question and answer session to detailing the specifics of those competitions and their success. But this last March, we awarded, we had one of the National Challenge awarded its prizes for the first round in the first year of competition. There were over 500 entrants in the competition, and we brought a short video for the committee today to give you a flavor of what's happening in the classroom with the ideas that come from our industry. And if we could roll the clip, I thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
And I thank you. Beg your pardon.
When I was 3 years old, I played my first video game.
I'm a really big fan of simulation games.
RPG, adventure, and action.
I got into game making when I was 10, and I decided, why was I playing the games? Why don't I make my own game?
The first program I wrote was to teach me my multiplication tables.
I used comments from my teachers and friends to make my game more fun.
After that, I took the game and gave it to my cousins. This is my user testimony. It teaches a lesson about teamwork.
When I grow up, I want to be a computer programmer.
I might be a doctor when I grow up. You'll be seeing me making games in the future.
now thank you for all of your testimony and remind members of the committee that we're still limited to 5 minutes on our questions, and I'll yield myself 5 minutes to start with. And I want to start out by saying how amazed I am, Mr. Norman, at the progress you've made from the day you broke ground out there, and how amazed I was when I just accidentally stopped by to visit you and to meet you there and to get to walk through your place to see youngsters at tables and success just obvious, and you trying to buy all the property around you to where you could expand. I thought back to Eric Johnson, who was a great man that bought Texas Instruments. And, you know, I was talking to him one time, and he said he bought Texas Instruments on December the 6th, 1941. On December 7th, 1941, he was driving out to see what he had bought. And I said, Mayor, as a matter of an engineer, you're great, but as a matter of timing, you're super, because December 7th, 1941 is a date that live in infamy that started World War II, and TI just went straight up like your company's done. And I had the privilege of witnessing the VEX Robotics World Championship earlier this year, and we walked through and got to meet with a lot of those youngsters. Talking to these brilliant and engaging young people and watching their enthusiasm as they competed and talked to us, both of us, about their robots. And that was really inspiring to me. And if I recall correctly, there's no prize, no monetary or otherwise prize for the winners of the VEX Robotics World Championship other than the thrill of victory. And those that lost seemed to be just as thrilled to have participated. And the one thing they were really moved in on was next year. They were getting ready for the next one. What's providing the motivation for these kids to compete year after year? What do you find?
Well, I think the main thing that's driving it, I mean, obviously it's kind of like the Flintstones vitamins. It's fun, but they don't really know what's good for them. And then once you start getting them involved, I had a case with my own son. He didn't know what I did until he started seeing the robotics and the programs and stuff we did around that program. So some of these parents that are engineers have, for the first time, taught their kids what they have done and what they do for a living, and they see us as professionals in the workforce creating these things, and especially for our toy division, for the high school students working for us and the college interns, to see something they worked on all of a sudden appear in the real world is pretty amazing. So that robotics competition does that same thing with all those corporate sponsors that are involved. They get a kind of a peek into what that company does and what it would be like to work in that kind of environment with science and technology as their background.
And VEX Robotics World Championships, an international event. Share a little more with us, if you will, about how these teams and alliances from different parts of the world work together in the competition, and how this provides and enhances very valuable communication and cooperation skill among the contestants.
Yeah, one of the aspects of the competition is basically forcing two teams to work together as an alliance against another two teams, and it changes each match, so you're not sure who you're going to be competing with the next time. So it forces kind of that be nice and don't do anything you shouldn't, and it kind of teaches them that professional respect you should have as you work in the real environment. So once again, it's life lessons as well as science and technology.
I'll send my grandchildren over there for you to talk to. What makes VEX Robotics different from other programs that are available today, and what does it take to accelerate growth and reach more students with this program, and what barriers do you face in achieving accelerated growth? Well, what holds you back? What are you concerned with?
Well, we've been involved, like I said, for 20 years and been involved in a lot of the programs out there, and a lot of them are extremely good at what they do. What kind of differentiates VEX is we started and dissected everything, as engineers do. We started with the platform, made sure we had the most high-tech platform we have, and also make it scalable so it's cost-effective. We looked at the program and how important the program was in mentorship from these other companies. And then the partners that you saw some of the 501c3s were involved with and getting those partners there. Then comes the daytime curriculum. You need to be in the daytime as well as extracurricular, and we actually accomplish both of those through our program. And really, our growth has been all grassroots, finding these companies to spend money instead of recruiting people to put their name out there in front of these students and help their environment. And then we, obviously any money we would get would help accelerate that path, but right now we're doing an extremely good job doing it the grassroots way.
I have about 9 seconds left. To Mrs. Conrad and Mr. Gallagher, I'd want to ask you, what do you find to be the most rewarding and inspiring aspects of the work you're doing? But I may get a chance to do that later. If I don't, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to write letters to you and ask you to answer these questions. At this time, I recognize Mrs. Johnson, the ranking member of this committee, a very good friend of mine and a neighbor of mine in Texas. I recognize you for 5 minutes, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. I am very impressed with the witnesses today, and I'm delighted that you've taken time to come. I have been working with some nonprofit groups that are attempting to improve and be a part of volunteers in STEM programs around the country. There are 200-some chapters. And one of the things that we have encountered is the lack of evaluation tools. So what I'd like to do is ask you to share some of the tools you use to evaluate your program and the effectiveness with students, and then allow me to copy from you. So would you start, Ms. Snow?
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously there's the normal studies. We just recently did a study through Georgia Tech to kind of put quantitative numbers on what's happening. But for us, it's really easy to see what we saw even in our local high school is all of these students that started not only started heading towards that science and technology role, but they also became the leaders in most of the organizations within the school, anything from a social thing to a chess club to a math club, and it really gave them that rise to be a leader as well. So that's one way, and also, once again, they come back in jobs. We see a lot of them come back as co-ops, and we literally build our entire workforce from the robotics community. That's how we've done it. We have 8 team leaders from around the country that are leaders in our company now.
Am I on? Now I'm on. Thank you. I need adult supervision all the time. We need an engineer. Is there an engineer? So we have a system that measures what we do. We work with a former NASA educator to help us with that. But in addition, we have a system that was designed by a student that measures the student's response to the work that we're doing. The student actually entered the ISAF, the Intel competition, with this matrix and used us as the guinea pig, and it was just such a fantastic system to measure a student's input into the program. So we've now adopted his tool as part of our measuring system. And I think if you're going to do student-centered education, what better place than to have a student-centered measurement tool in place?
Yes, from our perspective, the first thing is great partners. If I listed a number of them, but the Joan Gans Cooney Center has been an innovator in education for over 40 years. The MacArthur Foundation is extraordinarily dedicated to doing things that have an impact in the classroom. And from our perspective, our industry is very young and it's very action-oriented. We don't spend a lot of time talking about what we're doing. We spend a lot of time and energy doing it. So I would say the focus first on expert partners and leveraging their knowledge of how to judge success in the classroom from an innovation perspective, not from an inertia perspective, which if the members of the committee or Mr. Chairman, if you saw the movie Waiting for Superman, you can see the tremendous amount of inertia that's present in our education system. The partners that we work with have a reputation for being innovative and overcoming it. Second, the focus is on the kids. It's on the learner, not on the teacher. And when the learners are engaged, you're going to get a better outcome, and we see that intuitively. But both the MacArthur Foundation and the Joan Gans Cooney Center have put out publications that point to the catalytic value of our industry in engaging children on this path, not entertainment, but of learning. And much like Mr. Norman said, it's embedded in the process. It's not something that is force-fed to them. And then we also make sure that, or the partners look at how well the games not only are engaging, but they're teaching the material. They also have wonderful assessment mechanisms. When you have a scoring process in a game, the kids are being tested as they're going through it, and they don't even really know. It's just part of the experience, which also makes it fun and engaging. And then finally, it has to scale, because our goal is to develop solutions and exciting opportunities in the classroom that then can be spread throughout the country quickly, because we don't want to waste another generation of children while these innovations are once they're ready, they should go immediately.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Gentlelady has yielded back her time. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing and calling these witnesses. And let's just note that our founding fathers held technology and innovation at a high level, high priority. Very few things were actually written into the Constitution, but patent rights, the word right was only put in the main body of the Constitution when talking about the technology rights of an inventor or a writer. And of course, my favorite founding father was Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, Chairman Hall reminds us a lot of Benjamin Franklin, and meaning a very beloved man. I was comparing you to Benjamin Franklin, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, we were in law school together.
I thought so. The significance today is we know and we have the same value on innovation. American people place the same value in innovation and technology today. However, we are mired down in our society. We're being held back. And there are forces at play that are holding us back, and not the least of which is the failure of public education, which is mired now in bureaucracy and union roadblocks to excellence, and people in public education refusing to acknowledge that perhaps a science teacher might need to be paid more than a basket weaving teacher or something like that. So those of you in the private sector are stepping forward, and I think this is a natural happenstance in America, and that is the American people are stepping forward to correct a problem, and that is we don't have the progress, and we call it STEM, but we don't have the progress in science and engineering and mathematics that we should among our young people. And I'd like to first ask Ms. Conrad, in terms of your foundation, how do you, first of all, how do you pay for these awards and everything? I mean, you are not a government agency. How do you pay for your upkeep?
Good news and bad news. First 2 years, I funded the program. My children then said to me, "Mother, you're about to be put up for adoption." And the program got too big for me, so that was the very good news of this. We raise our funds through partnerships with large corporations, for example, Lockheed Martin and PepsiCo and Kraft, and corporations of that nature who really understand and work with us as leaders in developing the innovative workforce for the future. I mean, we are growing their workforce. The amount of money that the students receive as the award for this competition, and we don't do first, second, and third. We do one winner per platform. This year we'll be doing aerospace to create products for use in aerospace, energy to create products for use in energy. We don't care if it's renewable, storage, or efficiency. We don't say make this, and if you make it better than the next guy, you win. We just say here's the problem, make whatever you want. And in this year, we're going to challenge students in nutrition and ask them to help solve weight problems, specifically obesity and healthy lifestyles.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, so, I mean, they come up with things, they're so out of the box. We don't tell them there is a box, so they just jump right out and create amazing products. The award that they get, we fund one team that wins in each category. We fund them sort of like venture capital. We invest, quote, in their product idea. Some of them have come up with such outstanding products that we help patent them if they need a patent, and then help them license their IP into the marketplace. The kids get a $5,000 grant, and the grant is theirs discretionary. It must be used to continue to develop their product idea. So the funding comes primarily, well, at this point, almost solely from corporations that work with us. We also have had a discretionary grant, unsolicited grant from NASA Ames that has been very helpful to us, and NASA Ames has been tremendously supportive of our efforts.
I think Pete would be very proud of everything you're doing, and so am I. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back, and I now get to recognize the gentlelady from Maryland who sits just as far away to the right of me as she can sit. Recognize her for 5 minutes.
Wow, Mr. Chairman. You know, you started out, Mr. Chairman, this morning saying that there weren't a lot of us here, but I think it's important for us to recognize quality and not just quantity. And so I'm glad to be here with the members of the committee and also our witnesses, and thank you very much for your testimony. Among the occasional frustrations that I have here in this institution is that we are constantly insisting on either or answers, responses to questions in a really dynamic world that is anything but either or answers, and that is looking at STEM, the relative role and responsibility of the federal, state, and local government, of our private partners in developing this next generation so that it has the skill set to compete in the 21st century. And I think it's on all of us in each one of these sectors to do what it takes to develop that next generation. And I take it from your testimony that you share that. I want to start with Mr. Norman, because I do understand the value of STEM partnerships like yours. I know that we have Project Lead the Way projects in my congressional district in Prince George's and Montgomery County, just outside the city. But one of the things that strikes me is that it would be impossible to take advantage of the platform that you offer had it not been for federal grants and state grants and local support for the local school systems that are partners in those projects, that having the platform itself is not enough to engage students on an ongoing basis. We need the federal support that comes to our state and our local school systems to enable the resources and teachers to be able to effectively participate in those projects. You talked in your financial disclosure form. I noticed that you did not mention that you actually have an active grant from NASA, for example. I'm sure you have other, or maybe you have other federal grants and opportunities too. And so the work that you're doing and the platforms that you provide aren't just reliant solely on the purview of the private sector. There is, at least at some level, a partnership with the federal government. And so can you explain to us why you did pursue federal funding and what value that provides in your ability to develop these really innovative and creative programs for students around the country?
Absolutely. I guess the clarification I need to put in is I'm here representing Innovation First International, which has a company that is Vex Robotics that created this platform and finds those partners. The actual Vex Robotics competition is managed by another nonprofit called the Robotics Education and Competition Foundation. That foundation was created after years similar to Ms. Conrad, where our self-funding was getting overwhelming based on the size and the growth we had, and we thought the best way to actually be able to accept more donations from other corporations was to have that true 501c3 backing us. So we have actually kind of handed the management off of that competition to that nonprofit. That nonprofit has gone and gotten some NASA grants, And in fact, it's an extreme minority compared to the corporate donations that exist.
But I guess my point is, and I'll go to Ms. Conrad and Mr. Gallagher as well, is that all the things that you do, and I think they're really valuable and they're terrific, and you reach students, that in order to reach your traditional public school student who may not come from a background that allows them to participate in all kinds of other limitations, wouldn't you agree that we do need the combination of the value that we get out of our scientific and research institutions along with what happens in the private sector? I know in my community, NASA, Goddard, NIST, NOAA, these agencies are really unique partners, along with our university community that receives federal funding that enables them to assist in our K-12 education. So the federal government and its agencies are not an aside to the work that we do. It's a partner. Isn't that correct?
I will say that the partnership, and I will call it that we have with NASA has been extraordinary. It's not about funding necessarily, but it is about support in terms of facilities and mentors and information and something that you can't put a number on, but has tremendous value not only to the foundation, but to the students. I mean, our students, when they come to NASA Ames to do our Innovation Summit, they are so excited to be at a NASA facility, and Pete Warden comes and talks to the kids, and it's very peer-to-peer, and it gives them a whole different perception of a government agency. It's much more inclusive and more dynamic and interesting and exciting for these young students. The Department of State is working very closely with us now, not necessarily having anything to do with money, but support and collaboration and partnership. And I think when you create new systems and you do it through collaboration and bring silos of excellence together with a strategic plan of actually growing a new system of education, then everyone can get in the sandbox together, so to speak, and actually drive the change that needs to happen from the point of view of collaboration, which may or may not include funding.
Thank you. My time has run out. And Mr. Chairman, again, the point, though, is simply that that whether it's resources or facilities and those things, those are resources, that's money also. It just doesn't come in the form of cash. Thank you very much, and I yield.
Thank you very much, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Flashman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel today. This is really incredible. I've enjoyed it very much. I represent the 3rd District of Tennessee, which has the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in it and Y-12, so it's a very, very strong science-centric district, and this is really helpful for me. Mr. Gallagher, I have a question for you, sir. You testified that no federal dollar support is involved with your competitions. At the same time, the National STEM Video Game Challenge is touted as part of the President's Educate to Innovate initiative. Could you kindly detail for us how the two are connected and what the federal contribution is if it's not monetary, sir?
I'm very pleased to take that question, and it's something that we're particularly proud of. Is when it comes to the role of the government, we see it on the front end as being the beacon of leadership, and then once we develop solutions, exciting tools for use in the classroom, that they actually need to be implemented by government on the state level, because that's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to education. So on the with the White House, there's a great enthusiasm for the ability of our industry to connect with youth on STEM-related issues and STEM opportunities. And so we were put together with our partners through the leadership of the White House as part of an overarching leadership initiative that was not funded by federal funds. It's much more of a leadership exercise, and again, shining that beacon. And then we're in the process now. We're just going to start year 2. Will be announced this Friday in partnership with the White House again through the Department of Education. We intend to make that announcement with our partners. We're excited about taking the challenge to the next level. But when we have these modules, these units that are useful in the classroom, When those then need to be implemented, that's going to need to be done by the teachers on the ground, and it's through great partners like BrainPop that we would expect to see that happen.
Thank you very much. Now I've got a question. I'll start with Mr. Norman and going across the panel. Do you all track the college or career paths of your competitors, and if so, what are you finding?
Not from the company side. From the foundation side, they're putting plans in place to try to help track that. But at this time, from the company side and the product side, we do not track that.
Mrs. Conrad?
Yes, we are tracking it, and we are watching our students enter STEM-related fields in college.
Okay, so there's a direct correlation between what you're doing and productivity on the other end.
There seems to be at this
Excellent.
point, yes.
Mr. Gallagher.
Yes, our experience as an industry is almost in reverse. There's such a huge demand within our industry for qualified STEM-educated workers that we look at the university system and we see that as where they're grown. And we just released a study, the Entertainment Software Association did, that counted 343 universities around the country that either offer a curriculum in video games or have degrees in video game technology. 24 of them, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Johnson, are in the state of Texas. And I'm proud to say that SMU, your alma mater, also offers a program that is focused upon video game excellence and going right into this workforce. So we're seeing it more from we have a need, and then let's grow it from the bottom up.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, sir.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Ohio, Mrs. Fudge, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Just have a few very short questions. First, if you could each just tell me, in a program cycle or year, if that's your cycle, how many young people are involved in your program?
In the VEX Robotics competition, once again, there's several of the other partners that use our platform, but just in the VEX Robotics competition, we were running right at 4,000 teams from schools, and teams range anywhere from 5 to 15 students per team.
Okay.
Mr. Norman, we'll take your overflow. We're very small. We're very young. We get about 600 teams coming into our competition right now.
Okay.
And the National STEM Video Game Challenge, we had 500 students compete in year one, and then we'll look to see that grow in year two.
Thank you. Let me ask, would all of you agree that all students need to have STEM education?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I would agree it's a top priority for students to have a grounding in STEM. However, our economy is diverse. Our needs as a country are quite broad, and there may be a need for a broader range of skill sets.
I'm not saying
STEM.
Exclusively STEM.
Okay, all right, very good, yeah.
Okay. Now, let me also say, and I appreciate Ms. Conrad's comment about, how research and development in STEM fields have been the result of things like cures for diseases and how we sent people to the moon. But I would say that we all need to recognize most of that came as a result of government-funded research and development. And I think it's significant to say that. Certainly as well, I think that it is important that all young people have an opportunity to not necessarily be involved in a competition, but in fact to prepare themselves for what is going to be where jobs are going to be created in the next few years. I mean, there are some studies that say 80% of all new jobs in the next 20 years are going to come out of the STEM fields. So I think all young people need to have that opportunity. Let me just ask a couple of very quick questions again. What functions of your program are enhanced by involvement with entities like public schools and that are funded and regulated by the federal government? My colleague tried to get to that issue. I want to just go back to it.
With public schools, once again, most of the funding for our program is a school partnering with a local business and not actually going and trying to find state or government funding. It's actually literally finding a corporation in their area and having them sponsor that.
I'm not talking about funding. I said what functions. How do you interact with the public schools?
How do we
say
interact?
it that way? Yes.
Well, I guess the biggest thing is or a curriculum inside the classroom itself. I mean, it becomes a daily. The schools that have been the most successful, involved the longest, they actually create classrooms within the school that is actually the real robotics classroom instead of math science.
Do they provide the teachers or educators? How does that work?
Well, we have a couple of partners. We have Carnegie Mellon University that creates curriculum, and Teletech is a for-profit company that creates curriculum. Autodesk creates curriculum, and all of those together really help pull it to get it to the classroom. The most important thing, though, is getting the teachers trained, and that's where a lot of these same partners actually train the teachers.
They train the public school teachers.
Because teachers are scared of technology. Some of the teachers that are been in the workforce for a long time are scared of technology, and you have to get them over that hump.
Okay, I just want to be sure. So these are public school teachers that are teaching.
Public school teachers.
Thank
yes.
you, Ms. Conrad.
Thank you. Our entry into the school systems comes primarily through partnerships. We also partner with Project Lead the Way. We don't do curriculum, and we don't do teacher training. We have partnered with the National Science Teachers Association, which gives us access to a number of teachers who take our program in because it's an exciting way to bring STEM education into the classroom. So we're very much part of the in-class and after-school programs as well.
Great, thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
The function of public and private schools in our competition is principally to have the students that are available to compete, right? The 500 students that competed in the National STEM Challenge. So they spread the word, and partners like BrainPop are actually an organization of 100,000 middle school teachers that then are told about the competition. The kids then organize and then bring their projects forward for judging and for potential award.
Okay, thank you.
We also have the transmission mechanism at the end of the day will actually be through the schools themselves implementing these modules that are developed by these kids.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Brooks, gentleman from Alabama. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a quick overview, I would note that the vast majority, in my judgment, of improvements in technology over the years have been because of the private sector, where there is a profit incentive for people to excel. It might be new diagnostic tools in medical care. It might be new treatments in medical care. It might be technology, for instance, in the gaming industry with computer games or what have you. So our question here today is this additional bump that the federal government provides, what do we get for it? And is it worth the cost in this time of budgetary issues that everybody in America is familiar with? Now, that having been said as an overview, the federal government is spending more than $3 billion a year to improve STEM education in this country. Mr. Gallagher mentions President Obama's goal of recruiting 10,000 STEM teachers and recruiting 10,000 engineers. In the 2007 America Competes Act, back when President George Bush was in office and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, Congress initiated a program to recruit 10,000 STEM teachers, so the President's idea is not exactly new. Regardless, the federal government has been investing billions in STEM education for years, and the numbers do not seem to be improving dramatically. Is it a teacher issue, a subject matter issue, or something else? Are initiatives such as yours not only grasping students' attention, but holding that attention and developing it into something more? Any of y'all can volunteer any insights you may wish to share on the topics that I've just raised.
Yeah, I guess basically what we pointed out earlier is it has to be fun. Once again, back to the Flintstone vitamin. Once they get engaged, they realize it's fun. And also, once again, partnering with these corporations within their community. You're putting these engineers and these inventors on a pedestal, and you're basically creating someone that you want to be. It's just like everybody wants to be a quarterback of a football team. Well, when you're involved in these programs, you want to be that engineer that's designing and inventing the next toy or medical device coming out. And as far as basically, and going back to the NASA comment on funding on our program, it's my understanding that that funding is actually used as a recruiting tool for NASA for their future scientists and engineers to come work for NASA. It's really their recruiting program. It's not a, hey, we're going to give money to just pump STEM. That's a lot of the program they're trying to push in there as well.
Where's the one I had just before I had their name?
You talked about better teachers and things of that nature and better schools. I think if we can look at education from a systems point of view and look at it that it's not just teachers or the technologies or the students or the parents or the building, it's really all of it. And I think what the private sector can do that perhaps is more nimble is to take that systems approach and bring all of those silos of excellence together to really drive something superior in the STEM education field, because we're nimble and we can act quickly and we can respond to students and we can create student-centered education very quickly.
Congressman, I completely support the core challenge of your question, is that we, as I stated in my opening testimony, face a crisis of making sure we have the STEM-educated workers we need to keep ourselves prosperous here in the United States and keep us in a leading position in the world. And that gap that is at the core of your question is precisely what motivates our interest in this subject. So while we're not federally funded for the efforts that we're undertaking, and we're working aggressively to catalyze solutions, it is a bipartisan opportunity. It's a very, very important goal for us to tackle as a country, and we're much more focused about the solution instead of the cause. And we really want to develop those tools that are going to be useful in the classroom and ready immediately.
Let me have one follow-up question for whichever of you may want to answer. By way of background, my dad's an engineer. My 2 sons are engineers. My mom, my wife, and my 2 daughters are teachers. My wife, a math teacher up until the time I got elected, very active in the STEM program in her middle school. There's a control issue. Where do you think the control of these STEM investments should be? At the federal level, at the state level, at the local school board level, in the private sector, where you all tend to be? What do you recommend?
All of the above. No, actually, the local level for us seems to work better, and the reason I equate to that is from the standpoint of the corporations for us are the ones that provide the money, and it's that the key to our program is finding that teacher that was willing to be a champion and go do this. And without that champion teacher, then you don't have it. Obviously, funding from the high levels would be a huge rocket for this program, but we're building it in lieu of assuming we'll never get funding from the government.
I would comment that it's go to the core competence of the actors that we're seeking to engage. And the federal government is really good at drawing large attention and having large projects that capture the imagination of kids and provide infrastructure to a pathway that they can understand or be excited by. The states are the ones that are where I said before, the rubber meets the road, and that's where the implementation, the transmission mechanism has to happen. The private sector, we have a variety of tools at our disposal because of technology, because of the nature of our workplace. In my case, the engagement of our industry is that the youth pay great attention. Each one has a core competence to add to an overall solution.
I agree. I think that these smaller programs have the power to really drive impact where the government is looking for very large scale, very huge programs, and it's all based on evidence-based education and numbers. And young programs such as the programs that Mr. Gallagher and I have, we don't have that large scale to get the funding that would be from the federal government or through the states right now that will come. But we have the ability, as I said, to be nimble and to really drive something unique and exciting for these young students to get them engaged.
Well, thank you for your insight. And, Mr. Chairman, it seems that I owe you 2 minutes.
Ms. Johnson says we'll send you a bill. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses today. I want to continue this theme about the partnerships between the federal government and the various initiatives that you're involved with and others. And Mr. Norman, you've made a couple of statements that I'd like to repeat because I think they're good ones. Early on, in response to the question, you said that any additional money that you can get for your program will help to accelerate the projects that you're involved in. And then you said just a moment ago that funding from high levels would be a huge rocket for your program. And I want to emphasize that because Congresswoman Edwards introduced this subject of not getting stuck in an either-or kind of frame here, but really examining the full potential of partnerships to be developed between government and the private sector and ordinary citizens. I mean, I'm sure your programs pull in a tremendous number of volunteers, in a sense, who become as key an ingredient to the success of them as any of the more formal components are. And so these partnerships have tremendous potential. And there's been some reference to the investment made by the federal government in STEM education, suggesting somehow that that's maybe off base or more than it should be or something. And I think we should be very proud of that investment. And I think we should make good decisions about how that's going to be productive for our future. And I think your testimony, all of your testimony, is consistent with that perspective. So I want to thank you for it. And maybe if you could just, each of you, speak to it for a few more seconds on my time, I'd be happy to have you do that, because in an environment where the imperative every day seems to be to cut back, we're at risk of undermining the kinds of partnerships that you are engaged in, and can mean a great deal for our future, and frankly will pay us back in spades on the investment in terms of the new inventions that will be generated, and what it means for our competitive position around the world and for our economy. So I invite you to offer a few more comments on that if you'd like.
Yeah, and I think it's important that once again, when you look at the private sector and look at donations from the private sector, as I said, a lot of it is what I consider recruiting for that company and giving back to their community. But the important thing is rather than if every company involved with us just wrote a check, that wouldn't be impactful. Money is not that part. It's taking their engineers and the people in their community and making them heroes and making them want to be that person and go to that person. So that's where it's a little bit different. And when I say federal funding would extremely help, I'm looking at, we can't afford enough teacher training. I would actually take the entrepreneurial way we built our company, which was I would market our program. I would market the program to the nation and tell them what we're doing and try to get those companies to jump on board so that I didn't have to worry about that funding in the future.
I think all of us face the funding monster every year, and it's an annual thing. And yes, government participation in programs such as ours would make a tremendous difference. I mean, in scale, we would go to the moon, if you will. So it would be really fantastic if government could see its way to including young, innovative programs such as the programs we have in their funding cycles. That would be fantastic. And as Mr. Norman said, what's incredibly important beyond and above and with that is the integration of government agencies with our programs, with our students in direct ways, even peer-to-peer ways.
Mr. Gallagher, let me jump in and ask you a different question because I'm going to run out of time. Your industry has incredible influence over our young people. And, it can be for good, it can be for bad, I don't think it can be neutral. I'm convinced that one scenario for our future is that one day everyone will come home and play video games all night, and then they'll go back to work the next day and they'll be working at jobs creating video games, and that'll essentially be our economy and our world. And I see all these devices, the Wii, the DS, the handheld, all these things that really consume the imagination of our kids. And what I'm curious about is, are you all looking at how, on the gaming side, think of what happens at home, what happens in the entertainment and, as it were, leisure space of the next generation, and how you can start to tease into that connections back to education. So we're not thinking about what happens in school, what happens at home, but how to link those together.
Congressman Sarbanes, that's an excellent question, and the answer is yes, we are doing that, and it's through the first partnership that we developed. It's a competition called Game Changer, and the partnership focused on how do you take titles that are very popular with kids right now and add an education component to it, because as Mr. Norman highlighted earlier, if you make it homework, they won't do it. If you make it boring or monotonous, then they tend to be distracted to go do other things. How do we capture the appeal of our industry and channel their energy in an area where they're learning without really thinking about it? And the two titles that our industry made available, which is this is very highly protected intellectual property, but they said, okay, we'll open this up and make available. One is Little Big Planet, which was Game of the Year 2 years ago. That was made available by PlayStation. And the other was Spore, which is made available by Electronic Arts, published by EA. And both of those games are very creative, where the kids need to develop everything from physics and math to make the games work. They actually design their own worlds. They're doing that within a curriculum that is math, science based. So that's one example of what we're doing. On the other competition, it's focused on, core principle. We believe that we should be developing a middle class, not just of consumers, but of creators. And by putting the tools in their hands, like we saw in the opening video, that you're seeing the kids create their own experience. In that process, they are learning. And they're learning in a dynamic way that's going to be more applicable in the world that we're competing in today than where we were 50 years ago, which is unfortunately the classroom that they're sitting in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With good questions. Thank you, sir. Now we recognize a gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Quayle. He's famous for one thing, and that is that he's probably the youngest chairman of a subcommittee up here. And his father is also famous for being the father of this youngest chairman. Recognize Mr. Quayle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of pose this to all of you, but I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, and we have a really large and robust high-tech sector. And we have a lot of engineers and mathematicians and a lot of big companies that rely on engineers. And one of the things that they keep telling me, they say, look, the quality of the engineers and people who are coming out are just as good as ever, but the quantity is just really low. And one of the other things is that how are we going to really capture the imagination of young people to stay involved within math and science and engineering? And as we look at the graying of the workforce in the high-tech sector, especially amongst engineers, I've spoken to a lot of them who have said, look, I would really like to give back to my community and enter into the teaching profession. The only problem is it's very difficult to get in and actually teach because of the licensing and the certification programs. And we've had people who tried to and were actually rebuffed after 20 or 30 years within the high-tech field. I think that we're losing out on some great practical experience, not just the fact that some of them have PhDs, but the practical applicability of math and science that could really look at kids saying, hey, you know, if you take this algebra class and you take it seriously, if you take calculus and you take it seriously, these are the products that you get to make at the end of the day. So my question is I know that licensing and certification is on the local level, state and local level, and I want to keep it that way. But is there some way that we could have a flexible program, some sort of flexible accreditation that we could push and that we could really emphasize to make it easier for those that have the practical experience, who want to get into the teaching profession, who want to give back to their community, because that is giving back, after they're retired and getting in? Do you think that that's feasible, and do you think that there's a way to push that so that we don't lose out on all this knowledge that is just sitting on the sidelines that wants to engage these young people, but it's really difficult for them to get involved? So I ask it to all three of you.
I'll answer that briefly. I'm not exactly sure how to make that type of certification happen, but I will point back to that creating that, community heroes we keep talking about and that mentorship so that kids want to become that. I think you're spot on by saying if we had that person from industry and could talk about what they did and what they accomplished in their career, would obviously help push kids to want to be that person rather than the basketball player or the football player.
Mm-hmm.
And we work with Microchip very closely too.
Oh, great.
My response to you is the following. We have a very close community of mentors that work constantly with our young teams of entrepreneurs and innovators. And this is really a place where people like the folks you're talking about can drive an immediate, robust, amazing impact with young people, which may not be the classroom, but it certainly has a great ROI for what I call the graybeards. And when you really look at mentorship, it's a circle. These graybirds are learning just as much from these students as the students are learning from their mentors. So I encourage you to think about the vast array of amazing minds that can pay it forward through mentorship, and especially active mentorship programs such as the one we have.
Before you answer, Mr. Guy, but I think, Mrs. Conrad, one thing is that within the mentorship and within those programs, you have to have the kid, the child, the student to actively pursue that. Whereas if it's in the teaching, they're in the classroom, and you might be hitting a kid who might not have even thought about that subject matter, and then they just get inspired, and then they pursue it long term, and they're actually the future, creators of Intel going forward.
No, I agree with you, and I think one of the really tremendous things that we're doing within our program and in our competition is active mentorship. It's really robust, and there's a lot of people from companies and government agencies that are in there all the time mentoring our young students. So it's a way. It may not be the way. And there is a program, I believe, that Sherry Lansing created that brings, Sherry Lansing was Paramount Pictures. She's created a program to actually bring retired engineers and such back into the classroom and to offer training to them to enter the classroom.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Gallagher?
Thank you. Yes, three quick points. First, you're exactly right. The aspirational component of what our industry represents to kids mesmerizes them. You bring in a professional who actually has a very deep STEM education who's making video games, you put them in a classroom, and the kids pay rapt attention. They're very focused on how do I be like you? And so those types of the flexibility we think is going to need to be necessary in the out years once we have these modules in place where the kids will then say, all right, well, here's how I do it. Now I have this lesson module that makes sense, and these are more integrated as opposed to the separated nature that we have today. The second thing that I would add is that Quest to Learn is an experimental school. It was started in New York and now has opened a second facility in Chicago. The entirety of their curriculum is taught through video games, through their design and then through their playing and execution. And to demonstrate, again, that this can work, and it's going to take very novel approaches to take today's teaching core and be able to expose them to those types of methods. The third point that I would add is that that's being done in an aspirational manner by Senator Day O'Connor, former Justice Senator Day O'Connor, in partnership with Arizona State University. She has a game that she has developed called iCivics, which if it was developed in 2009, there are now 5 games that teach kids civics through video games. So you can leverage all of these various pieces, put them together in a successful way.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren, recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this hearing. As always, sometimes the questions my colleagues ask for as many questions in me as the witnesses themselves. And as I was listening to my colleague from Arizona, I was remembering William Shockley, who shared the Nobel Prize, coming and attempting to teach in my 9th grade science class. And he was a brilliant scientist, but he was a disaster as a 9th grade science teacher. So I do think, however, that engineers and scientists have a role sometimes in the classroom, and I do think that there needs to be flexible certification, but certainly as mentors and helpers. And I've been, as I think most of us have been, to science extravaganzas. I know that Synopsis in particular in the Valley has been very generous in funding science exhibitions. I remember I went to one this spring. It was, 7 in the morning, and it was East Side San Jose High School, so not the most advantaged part of Silicon Valley. And there was just like thousands of kids who were just vibrating with excitement over the science fair. And I talked to one young man who was a junior who had done an experiment in nanotechnology, carbon tubes, and he had secured the assistance of a company, their electron microscope. I asked him, did it work? And he said, well, I don't know, because the oven at the lab wouldn't get hot enough. So it's worth remembering that what we do in these wonderful events also relies on a properly funded school system. I mean, if you don't have a lab that works, it's not going to work. One of the things I'm interested in, in the Valley, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And so I'm interested in how we measure the outcomes of this. Obviously, to have 1,000 kids vibrating about science is better than a lot of other things they could be doing, even if there's not a flow into better grades or better careers. But our goal is to do better than diverting kids from mischief. It's to actually improve their education and to get them into a better spot. I just had a chance to read a report from a School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh indicating that in their analysis, the participation in robotics actually had no measurable positive impact in terms of academics. I don't know whether you all have the capacity, and this is my question really, to connect up with the schools, be they charter, private, or public, that are giving you your students to get the metrics measured, both to see how they're, and then also to fine-tune what you're doing so that those, the excitement also translates to academic achievement. I've seen kids at First Robotics is the big robotics in the Valley where, they're building something, but they don't necessarily, they haven't learned anything about electrical engineering. They haven't learned anything about math. How do we collaborate with the wonderful work that you're doing with the actual academic world, and how can there be feedback? What are the metrics, and what would you need to make that happen?
Well, I guess from my standpoint, once again, I'm more on the for-profit side, and as an entrepreneur, I measure my results based on what I see and what I feel, and that makes me run really fast. Funny enough, the person behind me is a teacher from San Jose that is the president of the REC Foundation, and that is kind of his job to figure out how to measure that. But what we do see is story after story after story of schools with a less than 50% graduation rate once this program goes into place. We've seen them go all the way up to 100% before.
So attendance is, you can measure attendance, and that's good. Time on material, that's a good thing. Is there any way to hook up, like, achieve the test scores with the participants and get feedback from the academic world of what you're doing to fine-tune the achievement?
I'm sure there is. There's obviously a lot of privacy issues you deal with,
Right.
especially with kids and what you can and can't track. We've had several brainstorming sessions of how to accomplish that, but part of the issue of our success is we're growing at such a rapid rate. Sometimes we're kind of the dog that caught the bus, and it's the resources.
One of the things that we are teaching, so to speak, is design thinking skills, real out-of-the-box capabilities, a very difficult thing to measure at best. Having said that, that's just part of what we do. So the design thinking skills are applied to product development. And as we see more products being developed and kids actually patenting and commercializing that product, there's a tremendous ROI, not only to the students, but to the world at large as these students solve these problems. As we grow and as we go and as we scale and measure more and more, I believe, like you, the juice factor is tremendous. Just getting kids excited to learn.
Oh, no, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
Having the excitement is valuable even if it doesn't result in a single increase in a
Right.
test score. But I'm wondering, can we do better?
Well, and excuse me, Councilman, but is test score everything? From the point of view of, are we serving the student by just giving them a test to measure what they've learned, and how do you measure design thinking skills?
Well, you can, it depends. I guess one of the questions is, what are the metrics you want to look at?
Exactly.
And I'm running out of time, so I don't want to cut Mr. Gallagher off, but I'm very interested, and I don't think it's something that the Congress can do, but to see whether collaborating, maybe we can even do this at home with, even Stanford, to see are there some metrics, certainly in the math arena, that's highly measurable, where we could help and really track performance, understanding that individual students have privacy, but when you have a group, you can get a group outcome as well.
I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, thank you for your leadership on so many issues in the technology sector. And in answer to your question, I would offer one example. On March 30th, we had an event here that was put on by The Atlantic, and it was purely focused on using video games in education and how do we do that from end to end, from policy all the way through to practical results. And Connie Yowell, who is a senior leader at the MacArthur Foundation, offered some thoughts along this line, which I think are particularly valuable in answer to your question. She immediately states up front that she has no love for our industry, that she does not have a deep affection for technology. What she's motivated by is, does what you're saying you're going to do work, period. And that's what she puts her effort behind. And her primary focus is exactly the focus of your question, is assessment. She believes that currently we are not assessing students properly in the classroom, similar to Mrs. Conrad's thought, and that the video game environment provides instantaneous feedback. You know exactly how you're doing in that moment. It provides experimentation for learning to then occur, and then there's a better learning process because the assessment is richer, deeper, and produces a better student at the end of the day. I think that's what she would say if she was here. If I got it wrong, I know she'll correct me.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I get to my questions for the panelists, I'd like to mention that Mrs. Conrad, in her discussion a while ago of mentoring, reminded me of a personal experience, and I know I've mentioned it before, but I think it has been a while. But it was one of the most satisfying experiences I've had in all my years of Congress, even though it took place outside of the halls of Congress. And that is that a number of years ago I volunteered to tutor a student who might need help in the local school up here where I live in Northern Virginia. And I was asked if I would tutor a young girl who was failing math, and I said, well, I'll certainly try. And this was a young girl who had all the stereotypes against her. She was from a broken family. Her mother didn't speak English very well. She lived in an apartment below a garage apartment that belonged to another family. And of course, there is sometimes the belief that girls don't like math. In any case, I, who didn't know what he was doing, tried my hand at tutoring for the very first time. At the end of a year, she ended up getting an O for outstanding in math and won a science award. And she is now in college and, in fact, was an intern in my office this summer. So it's nice to be able to have kept up with her over the years. But from that personal experience, I took or learned a couple of lessons. One was the importance of tutoring, particularly tutoring by those who really know what they're doing, and how much that can be helpful, just a little bit of an extra effort, perhaps outside of class or after school. The other is that I think it's important to to try to influence students before they ever get to high school. You have to really have an interest in science and math before that, or you're not going to be likely to take algebra as a freshman or calculus as a senior, or whatever it is these days that we encourage our STEM-type students to do. In the book, boy, this is a stretch. In the book, Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, Samuel Johnson is quoted as saying that much can be made of children if they are caught young enough. And I think that that is true when it comes to teaching them to enjoy the sciences or math or whatever it might be. You're welcome to comment on this, but as I say, what I took away from it is try to catch the children younger than high school to provide mentoring and or tutoring, and you can really perhaps change some lives. Let me ask my question to all the panelists, and you're welcome to respond to my lessons as well as my question, which is a little bit different. And this, Mr. Gallagher, plays off of a sentence in your written testimony. You said that, quote, "The current unemployment crisis is not simply a jobs problem, it is a skills problem." And I'd like everyone to respond to that, but if you would start, Mr. Gallagher, I think that actually is connected to my experience, which goes beyond jobs. It's teaching young people skills that they can use in jobs. And my understanding is that a lot of our companies today, perhaps particularly the high-skill companies, are not finding individuals with the skills that they need. And unfortunately, that goes back to what they might have learned or what they might have gotten excited about many, many years ago. But Mr. Gallagher, if you'll begin.
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman, and I appreciate your highlighting that one sentence because it is very, very indicative of the reality that our industry faces. Currently, Microsoft has openings. They're looking for over 4,000 engineers or computer science majors, and they're working very hard to fill those positions. Very hard to find and fill those jobs.
I wasn't here earlier, but I'm familiar with, and I'm sure they were discussed, how few graduates we are producing here in this country compared to the number of foreign students who are coming over to take those jobs too.
That is a very significant contributing component to the gap. John Riccatello, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Electronic Arts, will be here next week giving an address at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he'll be one of the themes of his remarks will very likely focus on a passion of his, which is that we do have this skills gap where we have tremendous needs for highly compensated jobs. The average wage in my industry is over $90,000 a year. Those jobs are highly sought after and very aggressively sought by those that are motivated in the STEM arena. However, the rest of the economy, there's a severe disconnect because of the competitive nature of the world economy.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Conrad?
You know, I think it's unfortunate that we have diminished the skills that are out there in the workplace, because I think if you kind of unwind the ball, at the core of that is that we don't have students who have a passion to learn. I call it the education Cuisinart, where we put kids in there and we just stuff facts into their heads so that they can take a test instead of real-time assessment as they're going. Education centered on the student rather than on a test, so that there's continuous assessment. And if a kid's snagged up, and this is what Khan Academy has done, which is brilliant. If a kid's snagged up in algebra, they help them get past the snag so that they can move on. And that has really, I think, part of the thing that has impacted our system of education in such a very, very strong way, that skilled workers, whether they're machinists or artisans or whatever they are, people aren't getting excited in the classroom anymore. It's not, as we talked about, Mr. Norman mentioned, yes, it's about fun, but you've got to get the passion re-engaged in our young people so that we can increase the numbers and not sit around admiring our problem in education.
Thank you, Mrs. Conrad. Mr. Norman, and Mr. Norman, I also noticed you developed a curriculum in regard to the robotics competition and so forth, and I think that could be helpful. But if you want to respond real quickly, my time is up.
Guess I have to hit the button first. There's several things that you mentioned. Recruiting is very, very important to this to all the workforce, and that's why I think that the companies that spend the money that they would normally spend in recruiting on a program such as this, they can help get that incentive for students to go involved in a STEM, and then also be ready for them when they come out. And a quick thing about the international, we deal a lot with international growth, and you would be amazed at how the foreign countries, specifically China, has realized that what they're missing, they create a lot of engineers and a lot of book-smart people, but what they've been missing all along is innovation. So they are highly endorsing these types of programs that are mentioned here at this table, to actually push that innovation and get that different thought process. And we're working close with governments of Mexico, Malaysia, China. You'd be amazed at the push they're doing to try to get that step.
Yeah. We need to equal or better the push that other countries are making, I think. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mrs. Sewell, gentlelady from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank all of our panelists for being here today and also congratulate you on the success of your programs. I wanted to address the issue of access. I represent Birmingham, Alabama, but I also represent 9 very rural communities in Alabama. And the reality is that we don't have private companies that have technology at their fingertips to help partner with our public schools or with schools in general there. And so there needs to be, I think, a concerted effort if America is to get back to #1 in the STEM education fields, to really address the access issue. The reality is that my old high school only has 4 microscopes for a classroom of 30. So it's lack of resources and lack of access. And so I'd like for each of you to address how you think we can get partners to see the value in developing the necessary infrastructure, if you will, to provide access to all of our children, not just those that are fortunate enough to live in Silicon Valley or California or places where there is a real community of science-related fields that can mentor them. What about rural America?
I think from what we've seen, I mean, it kind of comes down to the chicken and the egg. Once the program is started and the community sees what's happening, there's a big influx of support within the community where companies are giving $200, $300, very small, and even families pitching in on this program. So where I think it's important is to have not just a huge investment program where it's extremely expensive, thousands of dollars to participate. We try to be as scalable as we can, and when you talk with some of the programs that we're mentioning here, just getting some program in started is the most important, and then evolve to what you can get to.
We had an experience in a rural environment in the Navajo Nation, and the teams came in about 2 years ago, one team. Now it's like lots of teams. And because we're free and we're very user-friendly to all students, we're starting to grow a very big presence in terms of these sorts of communities. A third of our kids are inner city kids. And my thinking is, it's not how smart are you, it's how much can you take what you know, stretch it, and make something out of nothing, and come into this group. The mentors come in through the communities where these children learn, and it's all starting to come together as a movement in innovation.
How could we promote more private companies to actually want to come to rural communities and partner with them?
Well, the companies that we partner with partner across the board with us. So we reach into the rural communities. The partners come with us.
How can we encourage you to come to Alabama?
Just invite us.
You're invited.
Congresswoman, first a general thought and then a specific act as a thing that we're focusing on in regard to bringing the promise to rural America. First, we all need to leverage what's within our reach to deliver the STEM promise to all of America, including the rural areas, and that's the consistent theme, is what's within our reach. With the tools that we see, first of all, you have almost universal penetration of personal computers or PCs. You also have video game consoles, current generation consoles, in 70% of American households right now. So those two factors mean that the tools are present. You connect them with broadband, which there are very important policies that both Congress and the administration are pursuing to increase broadband penetration. It's in the homes of all the families, including in the most rural areas.
Oh yeah, Mr. Gallagher, you're definitely in all the homes in the rural areas. Game Boys are everywhere, and people do use that. But how are you leveraging that, and your association leveraging that very very critical resource that you have at your fingertips, because in moving and trying to penetrate those rural communities and step up the game when it comes to science, technology, and
there are two purposes of how that's done. One is driving the passion that Mrs. Conrad talks about, is that you lighten these kids an excitement about a path. You motivate them, and then they get over the hump on some of these STEM setbacks where it gets hard. That's one. The second one specifically is that ESA has a foundation. The foundation awards grants competitively. One of them is to Global Laurea. And Global Laurea is now a nationwide program, but it started in rural West Virginia and is focused on taking video games and teaching children 21st century skills through video games. And we have a very productive partnership in the grant that was done through Global Laurea.
Great.
I'd like to add one last comment, if you don't mind. One of our partners, which I mentioned earlier in the testimony, the BEST program, Boosting Engineering, Science, and Technology, they're actually a free program as well that gets people involved, and it's a good way to start out, and they're very active with Auburn University in your state.
Thank you.
Gentlelady, yield back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today and on STEM education, and an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. And in addition to serving on the Science Committee, I also sit on the Education Committee, where we're working to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And as part of that effort, I recently introduced a resolution, H.R. 378, and it's a bipartisan resolution expressing the sense of Congress that strong consideration be given to the role of science education in the educational accountability system in the next education reauthorization bill. And I introduced this because I believe that incorporating science and math in education is most critical, and it's most critical now than ever. A recent study showed that 21% of high school science departments heads reported that the facilities presented a serious problem to science education, and yet only 8% of schools surveyed reported that there was a lack of student interest, and so that was not a serious problem. So, if we were to meet the future demands of the complex, diverse, and competitive workforce, there's clearly a gap that we need to fulfill now. And so, my first question, and it's kind of it goes along with what Sewell was talking about, except that I was wondering if any of you are partnering with the local, regional, or state governments on STEM activities. Mr. Norman?
Sure. Yes, we do. And in fact, one of the partners, which is Project Lead the Way, that we work very closely with, works directly with the State Board of Education. And they actually, from what I understand, have a really close relationship there. And through that program, we grow that program and other programs with it.
Okay. Thank you. We've got, within the Elementary and Secondary Act, there's grants are given only for the LEAs, those that are the teachers and the schools, and cannot be initiated by non-government entities. Like, for example, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago is very interested in working with the schools and having the grants so that they can go to the different schools. Would you think that the STEM education would benefit from having these kind of grants being given to, almost educational groups instead of just the schools? Ms. Conrad?
Yes, actually, when we built our program, part of the way we reached out to grow scale is through partnerships with museums and science centers. They have a tremendous opportunity to bring community in to teach and to transfer information outward. So yes, I think that's a capital idea.
But it is making it very difficult without having the grants to be able to do that.
And it would be a tremendous effort if you can find a way to access that, not only into the museums and science centers, but have that ability for the museums and science centers to work with folks like us, which we already do, And right now, we've gotten to the place where we're now looking for some states and some groups of that nature that would work with us closely on that.
Well, look to Illinois, too. that would
I
be
love your
very
Museum
helpful.
of Science.
And then secondly, Mr. Gallagher, I know that I didn't get to hear your testimony, but I would welcome the feedback that you get, and all of you, the learning targets that have changed since the days of the Oregon Trail and Carmen San Diego. And I recognize the medium of games. I've now got 9 grandchildren that are walking around with all these tools all the time. And, the desktop or the iPhone has expanded, but has the complexity of potential skills expanded with that?
Congressman, that's a very good question, and we believe that the more immersive environments that our technology creates are critical for learning how to do your job in the 21st century. You need to juggle many different components. You have to make multiple calculations. You have to do them quickly. You have to do them dynamically, and you have to do them in 3 dimensions. That's not just how it's done inside of a game. It's how it's done in a competitive workforce as well. So we believe that in the right hands, the tools that we have as an industry can be used to catalyze those same thought processes amongst kids in a very productive way. And we also believe, and I emphasize this at the outset, it can be done now. The improvements that need to be taken need to be done now, not after we lose another generation of students that are not going to be competitive in the world marketplace.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Is there help for adults?
Yes, there is.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The round of questions are completed, obviously, and I thank the witnesses. And the book on witnesses is that we invite people who know much more about the subject than we do, and from that we arrange our bills and the legislation that we'll later debate. I say this, we've had good questions today, I think, and you've given very abundant, good answers, and I think you've been a very unusual group, and I thank you very much. Members of the committee might have additional questions for you, but I'm going to quit talking. I'm afraid some other member is going to come in and want 5 minutes, and it's right close to noon. But thank all of you. We may ask you to respond to these questions in writing. They'll do it within the next couple of weeks. And the witnesses are excused, and this hearing is, with my gratitude to all 3 of you and to those who back you up, we're adjourned.